From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you, and here's what's coming up. K-State's Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz will offer his latest advice on top-dressing winter wheat with nitrogen in the coming days. He says that even at these astronomically high fertilizer prices, research shows that a top-dress application at the full rate still pays off. He'll dig into that further. Also, K-State's Allen Featherstone talks about the emerging ramifications of the Russian invasion of Ukraine on the U.S. agricultural sector. That will be the theme of a series of K-State online sessions next week. Allen will have details on that. And on this week's horticulture segment, K-State's Travis Carmichael will talk about landscape flower bed design. All that right here on Agriculture Today. Welcome once more to Agriculture Today. Glad to have you along with us, and it's to you winter wheat growers we lend our next thoughts, and it's a really tricky decision now for those of you with wheat breaking out of dormancy soon in all likelihood, whether or not to top dress nitrogen to that wheat, given the current prices we see that are being asked for nitrogen. Well, Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz is a man in demand on this topic and has been for several weeks now. He's a crop nutrient specialist with K-State Research and Extension. We're going to go through some of the things that you think Dorivar producers should contemplate as they decide whether or not to top dress or at what rates and so forth. But it gets back to the condition of the crop currently, which may be iffy in some locations.
That's right, Eric, and I think that's one of the big challenges this year. One of the big questions is essentially going back to the condition of the crop. And we know we do have a lot of challenges depending on where you are in the state. In some regions, we have some very dry conditions, and obviously the crop is not looking good. So this is a key point that we need to keep in mind as we're thinking about top dressing, especially when it comes to rates. We have to keep in mind that rates basically is directly related to the yield potential that we have for that particular year. And so it is possible that in some situations we need to make some adjustments to the rate that we are planning to put out there based on the conditions. And that's maybe one of the key points this year as we're thinking about rates. Obviously, we do have ideally information on profile nitrogen that's available there, and try to take all of those things into account, especially, again, as we're thinking about on the other side of things, on the price of fertilizer, and obviously trying to take advantage of anything that's already in the soil, and, again, keeping in mind the condition of the crop this year and whether or not we have the yield potential.
Well, right to that key point on making adjustments and presumably to the downside on rates to economize would be the thought process here. What does a producer go by in making that decision?
Yes, and a lot of this obviously will depend on specific fields and historical numbers that each producer have. And so I think each producer needs to evaluate field by field and see where we are compared to historical values. But one of the things I wanted to emphasize here as well is that even in below average yield potentials, the response to nitrogen is typically there. And even with the high fertilizer prices, obviously the grain prices are also good. And so we have to keep in mind that again, that return to investment to nitrogen in wheat is always there. And so we need to keep that in mind. We obviously need to make adjustments to yield potential. However, keep in mind that return to investment to nitrogen is pretty high in most situations for a crop like wheat.
Then is going ahead at this point and taking a profile nitrogen test to assure what's out there or what's needed in order here?
That's still a possibility before applying any nitrogen, especially if there has not been any nitrogen applied since last fall. However, in most situations, hopefully producers already have some idea of what's there, maybe samples that were collected last fall. But at this point, it's still time to do that, especially, again, if we haven't put any nitrogen yet. And so that's the key point there.
Timing of the application. and when to optimize that nitrogen if you're going to invest in it.
Yes, and this is one key aspect. Obviously, we know that once we start to warm up and green up process, the crop is going to start growing fast. And so we need to have that nitrogen there. And so timing is a key factor. And I would say in most of our acres in Kansas, especially western Kansas, is ideally we want to have that nitrogen earlier to make sure that nitrogen is available there. Hopefully we'll get some moisture to get that nitrogen moving in the root zone and be available to that crop. Certainly we want to have that nitrogen before joining. That's typically the key growth stage that we like to watch. The earlier the better, I think, in this situation. However, one thing also to keep in mind is that, if conditions improve significantly and we find out that maybe a little bit short of nitrogen, we do have a little bit of possibility to do some type of split application and come back with another application later in the season. So that's always a possibility. So keep that in mind as well. Obviously, we have to be prepared to do that and have the capability to do it, but that's a possibility certainly. If we are thinking about maybe putting just a lower rate at this point and then watch how things are going and come back with complementing later in the season, that works well, and we have a lot of studies that shows that the wheat crop can definitely take advantage of that later application as well.
Whether you're putting your full rate on or splitting the application, as you said, the soil type can make a difference here?
Yes, and typically, actually, in situations where we have potential for losses of nitrogen, we prefer to have more of a split apply approach, if all possible. Obviously, this year we have potential for losses are not necessarily big. If we're thinking about leaching in sandy soils and that sort of things, maybe not a big concern. However, we do have some potential for losses, and one of those things that maybe bring us to the next point, which is the source of nitrogen. Right. With the dry conditions we have right now and that nitrogen sitting on the surface without rainfall to incorporate, we do have the potential for volatilization. And this is where the source of nitrogen can make a difference. If you are using dry urea, obviously the potential for volatilization, if that urea is sitting there in the surface, we do have a higher potential for volatilization losses, especially again as we are seeing warmer days, which again with that higher temperature, the volatilization process can really start to pick up, which is again typically not an issue if we have low temperature and we have the moisture to incorporate that nitrogen. So this is something to think about. Obviously, UAN, which is only 50% urea, will have a lower potential for volatilization. Also something to think about if we are using urea is that maybe this year we need to consider the use of urease inhibitors to just, again, minimize the potential chances for volatilization losses, which, again, it is a process that usually we don't worry much about for wheat because of the conditions. However, again, with this year, dry conditions and higher temperatures, we can see some level of volatilization in some fields.
I want to slip in here very quickly here as far as source choices here. There is a product that is a controlled release fertilizer, polyurethane-coated urea, and that might be suitable in cases where producers are worried about loss.
That's also another option, obviously, that will minimize any potential volatilization. We do see better benefit from things like ESM-coated urea in sandier soils, where also leaching can be an issue later in the year. And so, again, those are situations where we can get advantage from that type of sources. Also, one thing that we see more often is that, whether we're talking about dry or liquid, is including some type of sulfur source with it. And if we're using liquid, using thiosulfate with that, with UAN, obviously is a good alternative, and we can complement that. One option for nitrogen is ammonium sulfate, which is also an excellent source. We do get the nitrogen, and we do get the sulfur component there as well. And so, again, we do have a wide variety of options out there, and it really depends on the specific situation and obviously the economics, which is a big factor.
And one more thing here to touch upon. The application method, standard procedure here is a broadcast application, but you say there may be circumstances where another alternative would be considered.
Yes, and especially this is more relevant, obviously, in liquid systems where we do have the higher potential for tie-up, especially in broadcast applications. And so if we are using a liquid system for nitrogen, using things like streamer bars, streamer nozzles that would basically minimize the potential for tie-up is always more efficient. Also, going back again with the drier conditions this year, if we can stream that UAN and move some of that nitrogen in the soil already, obviously it's going to be more efficient than any broadcast application. So definitely something to think about. In a regular year, any improvement in placement obviously improve efficiency, but this year in particular, we may see even more benefit from things like streamer bars.
All in all, you're strongly encouraging wheat producers, it sounds, Dorivar, to move ahead with their nitrogen top dressing, the economics being what they are. This will likely still pay off as it shakes out.
Yes, Eric, and we look at some data from previous years, and even in situations where yield potential is below average, nitrogen still pays, and this is something that we have to keep in mind. I know it's a difficult decision, especially with the condition of the crop this year and the high fertilizer prices. However, we don't want to make things worse, and that's something that we have to be a little bit careful. We're already short of moisture, and at the same time, we're also short of nitrogen. Obviously, things can get worse. We also have to keep in mind that, again, the wheat crop can recover pretty quickly if we do get the moisture later, and we need to have that nitrogen there in place to take advantage of any moisture that the crop is receiving. So I think it is a decision that we need to think about it very carefully, and again, keep in mind that nitrogen typically, even in below average yield potential, is going to be profitable.
Very well. And we'd steer producers in the direction of an article that you put together on this very subject, top dressing wheat with nitrogen, in the most recent Agronomy e-Update newsletter posted this past Thursday. That's at agronomy.ksu.edu. And as always, Dorivar, thanks for the input.
Thank you.
Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz here on Agriculture Today, crop nutrient specialist with K-State Research and Extension. After the break, we'll fill you in on the details of a special series coming up next week, which will dive deeply into the impact of the Russia-Ukraine conflict on Kansas and U.S. agriculture. This is the K-State Radio Network. Agriculture Today continues now. Well, front and center in the headlines, of course, what's happening half a world away in Ukraine with the Russian invasion there and the repercussions of that. In fact, that will be the topic of a special series taking place next week, put on by K-State Agricultural Economics. They're dubbing it Risk and Profit Online Mini-Conference on the Ukraine-Russia conflict and the agricultural ramifications. We're going to preview that and talk about this critical matter now with Allen Featherstone, who is the head of the Department of Agricultural Economics at K-State. Allen, things happening hour by hour, beyond just day by day. This has really galvanized the attention of all across the board, and agriculture would be included.
That's correct, Derek. Since this began, we've actually seen wheat prices now in Kansas over $10 a bushel. Right. We've seen corn pretty close to $7. We've seen beans somewhere in the $16 range. And so it has just sown a lot of uncertainty with regards to the commodity markets. And in some respects, it's very fluid, very difficult to understand in terms of it's not your weather event that farmers are used to thinking about, whether or not it be locally or whether or not it be halfway around the globe. Once you get into geopolitical conflict that we have there, certainly it's one of those black swan events that you don't think about a lot, but have huge ramifications with regards to where we may be in the agricultural complex.
Just a thought here. How does an agricultural economist, a professional in the field, step back and assess the implications of such a sweeping event?
One of the things that I like to do is just get basic facts with regards to the size of the production, the area of where that produce is going to be, because that can give you indications with regards to, are we talking 0.5% of the world exports? Are we talking 25% of the world exports? And so certainly that can give you a pretty good idea in terms of what the potential ramifications are with regards to that. And then the big thing is you have to just kind of think through in terms of from the Ukrainian situation. They're a major exporter, and so physical damage to export facilities could have major multi-year ramifications before those are up online and working efficiently. And so they may have the production, but it may not be able to be exported. There's also the whole issue with regards to production. Right now in Ukraine, they're in the northern hemisphere, so they're starting to enter into spring. Wheat would be breaking dormancy where they're planting winter wheat. Obviously, they'll be planting spring crops kind of in the April-May period. The big thing is they're going to be the fuel to run the tractors, and is there going to be the seed, the fertilizer? They don't use near as much fertilizer as we do, but basically all of those supply chains, in terms of we talk about disrupted supply chains in the U.S., and what we're facing is nothing like what they may be facing in terms of bridges being gone, roads being gone, storage facilities being gone. There was the explosion at a fuel facility, and so that could certainly affect the ability to move diesel into the agricultural sector in Ukraine to get the crops in.
Massive disruptions in Ukraine itself, but it's worth remembering likewise as sanctions economically and otherwise are placed upon Russia for this action. That has repercussions for agriculture too because of Russia's role in the sector.
Yes, absolutely. In terms of a couple things, the Black Sea region was where the price of wheat was set. The two countries that essentially set that were Russia and Ukraine. In terms of looking at that, I think essentially in 2020, the most recent data, about 17% of the world's wheat was exported out of Russia and another 9.1% out of Ukraine. And so certainly there'll be issues with regards to whether or not they do export wheat, how they're going to get paid. The sanctions with regards to SWIFT and being able to move money have major potential disruption. I was looking at a study that basically indicated that some macroeconomists are estimating a 20% decline in GDP quarter on quarter in Russia. And the ruble has just crashed. They've closed their stock market. And so if you think about that from a U.S. perspective, if that would happen here, all kinds of economic ramifications, and we'll see that there. And probably the other thing that is pretty important is just they're a major exporter of fertilizer. It may not affect us this year in terms of, my guess is a lot of that's already moved, but certainly in 2023 there could be issues with regards to where fertilizer is going to be sourced from.
Then, as you and your colleagues in agricultural economics concluded something needed to be shared along this line, you came up with this mini-conference series. What are you hoping to accomplish with this, Alan, before we get into the particulars of it?
The goal is just to help people think through, give them some basic information, what they can begin to think about, how that might affect the markets, how that might affect their own operation. The thing is there's a lot of stories with regards to Russia and Ukraine, but we're trying to give some fact-based information with regards to what is their production, what is the location of that production, how important is Russia in the fertilizer market. We know they're important, but just how much of the world's fertilizer do they produce? In some respects, I think that provides kind of a base knowledge upon which you can begin to adjust expectations as the conflict escalates or de-escalates.
You have 3 sessions coming up next week, and these will be, again, online, and they will be over the noon hour each of the 3 days, Monday the 7th, Wednesday the 9th, and Friday the 11th of March. Give us the quick rundown on your co-presenters in this, if you will.
Yes, Brian Bergman will be talking about the macroeconomic effects. Hopefully he'll be going into the interest rates in terms of he's spent a career with regards to, or part of his career with the Federal Reserve Bank in the U.S., and so I think he will have some excellent information with regards to just how cash trade works. And so what are the effects of the sanctions? How easy are they to unwind? Should we choose to unwind them as a nation, or just what the ramifications are? On Wednesday, essentially, we're going to kind of focus on the energy markets side of it. We'll talk about the oil and gas industry, and certainly that's very important. And the oil and gas industry is certainly very important to the fertilizer industry. And so the second talk by Greg Eibendahl is going to look at just what's going on with regards to the fertilizer industry and provide some basic information there. And then on Friday, we're going to talk about grain market impacts and livestock market impacts. And so hopefully from the ground that we've built on Monday and Wednesday, both Dan O'Brien on the grain side and Glenn Tonzer on the livestock side will be able to give an indication, for example, if we lost the ability to export anything from Ukraine and if they just went offline for a year or two, what potentially could that do to the world supply and demand? And so those are the types of things that we're wanting to look at and just provide individuals things to think about. We don't have any answers simply because we can't read the minds of leaders of countries, but certainly we can provide some basic facts for people to think on as the conflict moves on, whether or not it escalates or de-escalates.
Free program, you say, and it's just a matter of registering for the sessions?
Yes, we do want registration. The main reason we want registration is certainly that gives us an indication of the size of the Zoom rooms we need. But it is a free program. But the big benefit is that we do want some discussion, we do want some questions, and so that's kind of why we're doing it live. And so I think it is important to jump on live, and we're probably going to have an hour of presentation and about 30 minutes of dialogue. So certainly I think that dialogue can be important, allowing individuals in the agricultural sector to ask questions, and we can help them think through those, or at least how we would think through them.
Well, uncertainty like this begets questions, and this is an opportunity for you producers and others to talk with agricultural economists from K-State about these key matters, the macroeconomics, the production and trade effects, the implications for the energy markets, the effects on fertilizer inputs, and the direct influences on the grain and livestock markets, respectively. You can find out more, Allen, at agmanager.info?
That is correct. Just go to the agricultural.info page, and it's there. Again, there'll be a link that will lead you to the registration page. We do want to make this available to as many that would like to listen in.
Look for the K-State Risk and Profit Online Mini-Conference, Ukraine-Russia Conflict, the agricultural ramifications. It's tagged right there handily on agmanager.info. The sessions from 12 to 1:30 on Monday the 7th, Wednesday the 9th, and Friday the 11th. Great program put together, and thanks to you and your colleagues for availing yourselves for this discussion, Alan. Looking forward to it.
Thanks, Eric.
Allen Featherstone is the head of the Department of Agricultural Economics here at K-State. We'll be back with more. This is Agriculture Today. We're back now on Agriculture Today, and it's our weekly horticulture segment for you now, and playing off of another of those K-State Garden Hour webinars, which took place yesterday over the noon hour, and the topic of choice, ornamental flower beds and how to make those accent your landscape to the fullest. And joining us now, the presenter of that webinar, he is the Lyon County Extension horticulture agent, Travis Carmichael. And flower beds and borders can be quite a highlight of any landscape, can't they, Travis?
They can, and bringing gardeners back around to the general concepts was the focus of the presentation yesterday, talking about keeping things kind of simple in groups instead of kind of the randomness that sometimes can happen, because I will personally admit it gets kind of exciting when you get out to the lawn and garden centers and see all the different flowers. Sometimes you forget that maybe we should buy 3 or 5 things that go together instead of a single plant here and there and go plant them. So sometimes if that happens where there's a lot of single plants throughout the landscape, it kind of comes across as more of what we call a circus effect. And so it really kind of draws away from the overall appeal of the landscape. So that was really the main focus of yesterday's presentation.
Well, then, what would be some of the ground rules for planting ornamentals in groups for the best visual effect?
So we start out with masses of 3 and odd numbers. So we start at 3, 5, 7, so forth. Again, as I mentioned, single, not so much unless we've picked like this perfect focus plant that we want everyone to look at. So it might be an oddball that not everyone has that we put in. That will be by itself. It's coming down to figuring out what you want for the overall appearance. Do you want that more contemporary look where things are more simplified, smoothing, curving lines, or do you want the hard corners, straight topiaries, more of a traditional formal garden? So that's the other big thing, is deciding what your overall theme is before you start picking out plants to go in the landscape.
Another point you brought out in the webinar, you want to choose plants on the basis of their mature size. Why so?
So we do that so we make sure we have enough spacing for them. And this is where we can see a lot of mishaps in landscapes, is people plant to the size that they purchased and not thinking about the actual size. And even when we put things down onto paper, it's drawn out to mature size. So we know that, okay, say we have a tree that gets 30 feet wide at maturity, then we can really figure out where to properly place it so it's not growing into the side of the house, or the roots are not encroaching on any foundations, and going from there. And even within a flower bed itself, that helps so things don't look overly crowded or mismatched, because we also want everything overall to be kind of uniform in size and uniformity, kind of proper sizing to the house and its surroundings.
Well, we'd ask folks to have a look at the video of the webinar, and that's fairly easy to access, isn't it, Travis?
Yes, it is. It's located on the K-State Horticulture and Natural Resources website, and it will be under Extension and the K-State Garden Hour.
It's easiest to simply search for K-State Garden Hour. That'll take you right to the archive of the previous Garden Hour webinars and the most recent ones, including the one that took place just yesterday, on landscape design, with the emphasis there on selecting flower bed material for planting this spring. Have a look at that. Travis, thanks for your time and this input. Appreciate it.
Yeah, not a problem. Thanks for having me.
Thursday Carmichael with us. He's the Lyon County Extension horticulture agent. On this week's horticulture segment, rounding out this Thursday edition. Thanks for tuning in. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.